Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in our Fall Tech Talk webinar series. Today on the topic of Start Shaking. My name is Lance McCall, the Global Campaign Manager here at Ribbon. And today we have Dan Teichman, Ribbon's Director of Solutions Marketing, on with us, as well as Jamie Gibson. You can see them both on your screen. Jamie is our VP of Sales Engineering. And we also have Elizabeth Page, Director of US Sales, on with us as well. To help do some Q&A and give some other insights as we go along today. But before we get started, I wanted to point out the Ask a Question box. It's located on the bottom right of your screen. Please ask us any questions you have as we go through the material. We'd love to hear from you. If you don't see that box, you should see a question mark. Just simply click the question mark and the Ask a Question area should slide over and you should see that there. We also have a takeaway under handouts. You should see a little document icon. We have a checklist, a Start Shaking checklist for you there. So take a look at that. And as I mentioned, when we get towards the end, we'll do a little Q&A. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Dan, who's going to get us started. Dan?
Thank you, Lance. So good morning to everyone. Let us jump right into this. So here's the agenda for today, the content I want to cover. We'll talk a bit about the latest status on Start Shaking. I'll go run through some basics. I hope many of you know this, but if not, it'll be a refresher. I want to talk a bit about a plan to meet the June 2023 deadline. We'll talk probably most of this webinar on Start Shaking implementation options from Ribbon. I do want you to understand what we have to offer. And then 3 additional related topics that I want to make sure we cover with a couple slides on each of those. And then I'll wrap it up. So with that, let me go ahead and jump straight into this. If you look at this slide, you'll see we've got this split between the past and the future with the timeline right about where we are now. So I want to make it clear to people that Start Shaking is a journey, and it's a continuing journey. Right? There's been a lot of work by the FCC, by industry forums, by network operators, by vendors such as us to prepare and implement Start Shaking. The FCC has been a big driver, along with the industry forums like Attestation, in taking a pragmatic approach, allowing the markets to find success through best of breed ideas, having a phased approach that prevented disruptions in the industry. As in your ruling is today and you have to implement it tomorrow kind of thing. That's not a very viable way to get around doing things. And then again, being able to react to the changing tactics of bad actors and how that changes the decisions that get made in the industry and how the FCC makes their rulings. And then going forward, we're going to see additional implementations for Start Shaking. We're going to see things like adoption of rich call data and delegate certificates to increase call answer rates. We'll see use of analytics, increasingly use of analytics to mitigate robocalls. We'll see increased enforcement. On October 3rd, this is a really interesting data point. So a little over 2 weeks ago, the FCC issued essentially a notice to 7 companies that they had 14 days to show cause why they should not be removed from the FCC's robocall mitigation database. And they were basically told, you haven't not met the obligation of providing sufficient steps to combat robocalls from originating on your network. And you need to do that. So the FCC is getting very serious about this and it raises the visibility of how and what you implement and your obligations to be successful. We'll see increasing analytics, like I said, and I believe we're going to see more continued conversations about TDM network interworking with Start Shaking. I'll bring a bit of that out later on in this webinar. And obviously, we want to expect that there'll be continued migration to interconnect IP, which is obviously I think the goal here. So with that, I want to touch on a timeline a bit, and I don't think any of this is new for people. If it is, hopefully it will help understand where we're at. But just over the past 2 years, right, back in September of 2020, right, the FCC made the ruling that basically gave most of you on this call a 2-year extension to implement Start Shaking. And as part of that exception to the rule of implementing it earlier, you had to establish an originating robocall mitigation program. Now, there's been some unique differences, for example, in the state of New York, and there's been other things about different types of carriers, such as non-facility carriers that had different obligations. But in general, I think for the people on this webinar, the focus was we don't have to do anything today. We have some obligations, but we're going to have an extension until June of 2023. Well, as part of that, expanding rules at the end of 2020, the FCC also mandated that if you were using a solution, an analytics-based solution, as a terminating provider to do terminating robocall mitigation, right? You had some additional safe harbor rules. You were protected from things you might do, but if you blocked the call and you used analytics to do that, you're also required to notify the call originator. I'll touch on that a bit as we go through the webinar as well. And then in April 21, right, the FCC established a robocall mitigation database, which all voice service providers had to have a valid entry in, or the next top carrier could reject their traffic. So again, I am making an assumption here that everyone on this call has an entry in that database for your traffic being handled today. As part of your obligation for an originating robocall mitigation program, that would be what you had to file into the FCC's database, or if you were doing stir shaken, or if you had a combination of both in your network. Right? In May of 22, so earlier this year, the FCC also required all U.S. voice service providers to only accept calls carrying U.S. North American numbering plan numbers if the call was coming from a foreign originated provider. So while that may not hit your networks very much, just be aware that they also have to be in the FCC robocall mitigation database, or you don't have to accept their calls. And we know that foreign originated calls tend to be the majority of the problem for robocalls. And again, the FCC is looking at ways of stopping this. And then finally, there you are, June 30th of next year. That's your deadline to implement stir shaken. So what do we do next? Well, let's talk a bit more about the details and the basics of stir shaken, and we'll talk some more about implementation after that. All right, this is a busy slide. It's the shaken framework. I am not going to try and present this in detail to you. That is not my goal. My goal, though, is to show you that the items in blue, as a voice service provider, that's where your obligations will be, to implement the portions of the solution related to key management. That's the certificates and how the public and private keys are managed, as well as call management portions. So that's what we'll talk about in this webinar primarily. And you don't have to worry about the details behind these individual functions as much as these are the things you will implement in whatever choices you make for how you implement stir shaken. All right, so this is a basic stir shaken call. The calling party on the originating carrier, the originating carrier, let's say that's you, are responsible to determine the proper attestation level for that call. That is the trust level of the calling party. To sign using certificates that call, to put the proper caller ID information in the SIP header that goes out for the outgoing call. As the originating caller, you have three choices for attestation, A, B, or C. So an A attestation is what's called full attestation. So if you're the provider who has the call originating on your network, you know the customer, you know that they have a right to use that telephone number. That makes you the telephone number service provider as well. Then you would give them an A. You're saying when this call originates, I trust this originator. It should have the highest level of attestation. A B would have you as the signing provider, and you know who this customer is, but you don't know the source of the telephone number, meaning you did not give them that telephone number to originate a call. So you'd give them a B attestation. It's a partial attestation. And then C is a gateway attestation. So if you're the signing provider, but you have no relationship with the initiator of the call, nor can you authenticate their right to use the telephone number, you're basically going to say, I don't know who this is. And that makes a difference on how things get terminated on the other end. The intermediate or transit carrier is responsible to pass on the stir shaken information transparently without modifying anything. Their obligation is not to do anything. And then on the terminating side, the terminating service provider is going to be responsible to verify the authenticity of the information received by going through a verification process using that certificate information and the public and private key information, and then terminate the call accordingly. So that's stir shaken at a very, very high level. So what I want to do is spend a little more time here talking about some options here. Let me actually go back for a moment. So some of you will implement stir shaken. I'll talk about implementation choices later, but whether you choose to do that in your own network or you choose to purchase stir shaken as a service from a service provider, those are your options to do it yourself. However, you may also choose to hand traffic off to a stir shaken as a service provider. So here you are the originating carrier, but you've chosen not to do stir shaken, not to do the signing. Instead, you're going to hand off your traffic to a stir shaken as a service provider, for example, Bandwidth or IntelliQuint or other carriers are offering these services. As the originating carrier, you will need to have a certificate and the private key information that's going to be used by that stir shaken as a service provider who will sign the call on your behalf. But they're signing it on your behalf using your certificate. They're not signing it using their certificate. So this is really important that when the call is being signed, it's signed using the certificate from you saying you understand the obligation and you've done the attestation, you've done the authentication and provided the attestation of the originator. So your obligation, again, is to put that attestation information into the SIP invite that's going to be sent over to the carrier. So it's IP interconnect, you're handing your traffic off, and now this carrier is providing a service on your behalf. And then they're going to send the signed call out, and that's it. The rest of it works the same as it does. Now, I know some people are looking at this model, or people may have already invested in this model. It's a perfectly fine model. It depends on how much investment and what responsibilities you as the calling party or the originating carrier wants to handle. I do want to point out one other item. It's kind of important. Signing is not always needed, right? And in this example here, you can see the calling party and the calling party are in the same single service providers network. And with our C15 and our C20, we support the ability to do tagging and termination. So we can provide the equivalent of the stir shaken information that attests to the call, and it goes to the other end, and it can still be provided, and information can be provided at the calling party side. You would only sign calls if they're sent to another operator. So again, the last two slides I showed, either you're signing the call and sending it out to the next top operator, or you're doing the attestation authentication piece, providing the information to somebody else who's signing the call on your behalf, stir shaken as a service provider, and the call information goes out. So I just want to make this clear. This is an option, and for some of you, this will be useful if you don't already have this implemented. All right, with that, I do want to talk a bit about how you get to June 2023. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because we have a lot of ways to help you in more detail. But there's a place to start, and that place is an implementation checklist. So as Lance mentioned, we do have a stir shaken customer checklist. It's available to download the webinar. This is a list of things that have to be done in order to participate in stir shaken, pre-implementation steps, implementation steps for stir shaken, testing that would need to take place. And ultimately, after that, you need to update the FCC robocall mitigation database to reflect something you're doing now that you wouldn't have done before if you had not implemented stir shaken. We don't expect, honestly, we don't expect people who are listening to this webinar to go say, well, let me go try all this on my own and I don't need any help. I mean, that would be great, but realistically, we are here to help. Both Ribbon and our partner Eastwind, we have the expertise to help you understand how to get through this process. to help you understand potentially which implementations options best meet your needs, things that you should be aware of. And again, we've done this multiple times. So the whole goal is to say, think about what you want to do. Don't wait to begin. Look at this information, engage with Ribbon, we'll engage with Eastwind. Together, we'll figure it out, because the goal here is to help you go live before June 30th. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't wait till the deadline, but if you do it earlier and you're up and running and you're ready and it works, the deadline comes and goes. It's not a traumatic experience. So I can't emphasize enough, you should begin the planning process to get to a point where you're ready to go live before June 30th, 2023. All right. I want to actually spend a little more time and talk about implementation options, because that's clearly where the rubber's going to hit the road. So we have two stir shaking options. The one shown on the left here is stir shaking as a service. So we do provide that. It's a Ribbon cloud hosted subscription service. It is a complete stir shaking solution. It is the most economical and viable and fastest deployment path, we believe, for you. In this option, Ribbon takes on nearly all the costs of operating the service. There's a rapid turn up with minimal effort. The options that you have for what we can provide you are very straightforward. You may in your network need a switch software upgrade. You may need a session border control if you don't have those. Again, we as Ribbon and Eastwind as our partner can offer professional services. We can walk through this, but it is again our goal to make it simple for you, and I'll talk some more detail about that as we go forward. And similarly, the alternate option is to deploy the secure telephone identity. That's the bulk of the stir shaking functionality in your network, right? So we have a secure telephone identity, or an STI product, that is deployed in your network. It will still utilize Ribbon cloud hosted services for dealing with certificates. I'll show you what that looks like. It doesn't become both a CapEx and an OpEx solution for you. Again, you may need switch software upgrades and or a session border controller or a policy server in your network. And again, we also have professional services for that. So I think it's fair to say that the choice is yours. We're going to help you make either of those choices based on your criteria and help you get there as fast as possible with hopefully as seamless and least amount of conflict as possible. All right, what I want to do is talk about stir shaking as a service. Again, I use that same stir shaking framework image I showed you earlier, but now I've labeled all of the parts that are part of the Ribbon cloud hosted offer in this ribbon colored cloud, and showing you everything we do. So everything I mentioned before at the call management layer and at the key management layer that I said you would have to do is part of our turnkey solution. And as you can see on the top where it says STICA, that's the STI certificate authority. Ribbon is also authorized as a STICA. So you can come to us for the certificate that you need in order to go ahead and do the rest of the stir shake implementation. The only investment in your network, again, like I said, may be an SBC. If you don't already have one, it does not have to be. It can be anybody's SBC, as long as it's going to either talk to our service using SIP, or potentially some SBC providers will give you the ability to use the Addis REST API that's defined for this. Again, it can't be any simpler, I hope, that all of this is handled by Ribbon on the cloud side. The alternative, oh, sorry, let me jump through this and show you another slide on this. So if you look at this, you've got, and again, I just use C15, C20 as the example of the TDM, of the switching side, excuse me. An SBC, I show a Ribbon SBC, it could be a third party as well. And that session control, the only connectivity you need, again, as I just showed in the last slide, is a SIP invite over to the Stir Shaken as a service from Ribbon. So it's hosted on our Identity Hub platform, which is our cloud-hosted platform. We're providing this as a service. You're basically going to send us enough information to come back to you with signed information in the header, and then you're going to send the call out to your interconnect carrier. Again, it's a very simple access to a complete solution. We are entirely agnostic as to who that SBC provider is or that SBC vendor is. We're agnostic to how you send that traffic out to your interconnect carrier. Again, we are simply providing the Stir Shaken signing function for you. And I think, again, like I said, I think this is the simplest, most economic, viable path for you. The alternative, which is to deploy it in your network, same diagram now. But here you can see there is a symbol on the screen here for this STI product, and it's performing all of the functions that are highlighted there in the boxes, the pink fuchsia boxes. So you'll do those functions in your network, and then you will still connect to or communicate with Ribbon's STI-CR functionality and Ribbon's STI-CA functionality that are in our cloud-hosted solution. In theory, you can use anybody for your STI-CA, but if you're using everything else from Ribbon, it would make sense to use our solution as well. And again, here, the SBCs will talk to the policy server, and the policy server will talk to the Ribbon-hosted solution, or the Ribbon, excuse me, your STI in network, and then from there into the Ribbon-hosted solution. And that looks like this from a call flow perspective. So the SBC is talking to PSX, it will talk to STI. The STI will also then talk to the Ribbon hosted solutions for either certificate repository or certificate authentication services. And again, the information comes back, call gets routed from the SBC back out to the carrier with the proper Stir Shaken information for attestation and signing. So in this solution, you have a complete solution in your network, the right things you need in the cloud. It gives you a higher investment profile as you require some additional CapEx and ongoing responsibility for OpEx. But if that's your choice, it gives you additional ownership and control over your solution. So we want to make it clear that we have both options for anybody. I don't know, because I need to look. Jamie, do we have any questions? Anyone's come in on either of those options?
We have some written questions that are coming in down. I'm in the process of responding to at least one of them, but not specific to that.
Okay. All right, with that, let me go ahead and talk about these three additional topics. I said I would talk about Stir Shaken and TDM. We'll talk a bit about originating robocall mitigation and why it's complementary to Stir Shaken as a service. And I'll talk a bit about notification of call blocking if you are doing that based on terminating robocall mitigation using analytics. All right, so TDM and Stir Shaken. I know it's a subject that people are interested in and trying to understand what the obligations are and what's happening next. So I want to be very clear. There is no FCC ruling regarding TDM and Stir Shaken at this point, nor is there any indication what timeframe they will require solutions to be implemented. It doesn't mean the FCC is not interested in having discussions on this subject. They, in fact, did request information about this subject back in May. And interestingly enough, they received, in their terminology, a wide range of responses. And those responses, many of them were, yes, we need to enable TDM Stir Shaken interworking. And other responses were, no, we don't need to do that. We need to get everything moved to IP. And so the FCC, at that point back in May, and the responses didn't do anything. And now, again, they've recently circulated a draft notice of inquiry to seek further comments. There's a discussion on that draft at their upcoming meeting later on this month. but again, there's no official date on when that inquiry will be published. And that inquiry is just that. It's an inquiry. It's not a ruling. So we don't know when they may rule. What I will say, though, is the FCC had promoted or pushed or requested or asked, whichever word you would like to use, that the industry start trying to figure out how to do this. And there are two ATIS standards that define solutions to interwork stir shaking with TDM. One is to extend stir shaking over TDM using existing in-band SS7 signaling. I'll go through that in more detail on the next slide. And the other is to use out-of-band signaling using something called a call placement service. So this is I took the picture we had before, stir shaking, and I've just pulled out just the originating piece here. And I want to talk through what this would look like for extending stir shaking over TDM. So here, as the originating carrier, again, you're responsible for the attestation for determining the validity of that originator. And you need a way to put that information into TDM so that it can be handed off and be visible to the local tandem. This is different than what I showed earlier, where you're doing the authentication, the attestation information, and putting it into SIP and IP, handing off to a stir shaking as a service provider, or as the originator just to the next hop. The reason this is different is the stir shaking as a service provider, such as bandwidth, right, aren't going to give you a TDM interconnect. They're going to say, let's do this over IP, right? The challenge here is that going to a local tandem, you may not be getting an IP interconnect. So what is the TDM way to make this work? So this ATIS 95 document, of which Ribbon was a primary author, was focused on how do we extend stir shaken over TDM, reusing existing SS7 capabilities already available in your network. So it's implemented on a bilateral agreement that's between you and the local tandem. And because it's bilateral between two parties, it allows you to be able to negotiate what it's going to look like between you and the next hop carrier. And so the standard has three methods to convey the attestation level information. So the primary method is to use the screening indicator in the ISIP calling party number field. And so the idea is that there is a way, it's defined in the standard, to map the attestation level to the ISIP SI field and have that information be represented and common for what it's being received as at the local tandem. So they'll know in the SI indicator what that stands for. And then again, from your part, you've met your obligations. Now the local tandem has to handle what it does with that information. Maybe it has SIP outbound, and it'll do the conversion and put information into the SIP header and go out. Again, from your obligation for an originator, you've met your obligation by providing this attestation information. An alternate method is to segregate your TDM traffic by trunk groups with a specific identification. So you have an agreement that says trunk group 1, all this traffic will get attestation A. All traffic on trunk group B will get attestation B. And maybe you have trunk group 3 for C. What this does is, instead of using the SI indicator, now the recipient of this information says, I know all this traffic coming in. You as the originator are telling me that you are the responsible party who knows the customer, knows their right to use this number, and therefore you're telling me it should be an A. I will put an A on whatever I send out. And the third option is to actually define the use of the STI passport information. So that's essentially the information you need to create that is the information you must pass along to the next hop provider. It's called the passport. That can be put into the ISIP user-to-user information parameter. The problem with that, and it's not a negative, it means it can be used, is that the ISA UUI parameter is already being used for other things. So this part of the spec says basically there's 5 mandatory criteria which have to be met in order to use this UUI option. And the most critical one is it's not already being used between you and the next local tandem provider for any other purpose. If it is, it can't be used for this purpose. But I want to make sure I was clear that there are 3 options in the ATTES standard. So this is a way you can, again, the FCC has not mandated this. Again, as I said, the industry has come up with some solutions. What the FCC is going to rule, nobody's quite sure. Let me move on to my second subject, which is originating robocall mitigation and why it's complementary to stir shaken. So as I said, if you earlier had gotten an extension and not implemented stir shaken, you had an obligation to do originating robocall mitigation. Now, so I'm assuming everyone on the call has some form of that program in place. It may not have been done using an analytics-based solution like I show here. The FCC did not specify how you had to do it, only that they made it clear that the goal was to have a method to block spam and stop fraudulent traffic from originating on your network. So I know people who have decided the best way to meet that was to purchase an originating robocall mitigation solution and purchase it as a service. So that's what I show here. This is Ribbon's reputation scoring service. Again, it's a hosted service from us. As the call originator, you would default route a SIP invite to our reputation scoring service. Based on analytics, our reputation scoring service either responds with a SIP 503, service unavailable, which indicates our analytics consider this call legitimate, and you'll just go ahead and process that call, and it'll on the next route, it'll go outbound as a normal call. Or we would return a SIP 608 message indicating the call is likely illegitimate, the spam or fraudulent, and the call should be blocked. And then you would block the call. So this is in use today, and it works just fine. So now you might say to yourself, well, when I do stir shaken, can I stop doing this? Or should I stop doing this? And the answer here is you should continue doing reputation scoring service as the first line of defense to prevent fraudulent traffic from originating on your network. However, since the same Ribbon platform and the same hosted services also include stir shaken as a service, what you'd be able to do is, if a call is illegitimate, we're going to let you know that and you're going to block it. If the call is legitimate, we'll go ahead and sign the call as you would if you were just asking us to sign the call. Now you've got 2 weapons, if you will, to prevent illegitimate calls from originating in your network and to actually get the right information in the call so that it can be properly sent outbound to the interconnect carrier. And all of this is going to happen in real time for every legitimate call. And again, it's an opportunity to use the same infrastructure for multiple services. And we think that's a pretty valuable thing to have. And here's the third topic I wanted to talk about. Notification to the call originator if their call is blocked by the terminating service provider using analytics. So the call starts on the far right, bottom right. Traffic comes into you as the terminating service provider. And it's both legitimate and spam and fraud calls. You don't know what that traffic is that's coming in. Excuse me. But if you're using a service like our reputation scoring service to do terminating robocall mitigation, so you're going to send up the query to us. We're basically going to provide analytics and let you know whether or not this call is identified as legitimate, pass it on to the end user, or it's spam or fraud, and you should be blocking it or sending it to some other treatment. So again, people are using this service today. It works. It's all good. However, what the FCC ruled back in December of 2020 was that if you're doing this as a service. This is to help your customers not receive robocalls and fraud attempts or illegitimate robocalls and fraud. Then you need to be sending back the proper SIP response message, a 607, a 608, or even a 603 in the interim, back to the network where it originates, back to the originator. And if you're going out TDM to get back there, you're also going to have to work with ISO 21 response codes. So that was the obligation. Now, what it turns out is conversations in the industry and in Addis went ahead and defined something called 603 plus. And that's an alternate response message, which is different than the standard 603 that everybody supports today. And what it did was it provided two things: a unique reason phrase rather than the default 603 reason phrase. So the default 603 reason phrase simply said decline. Now it can provide a unique reason phrase like network block. Okay. It can also contain in the SIP reason header additional information that's not in the 603 reason header. So in this case, it now also includes contact information of the entity that was responsible for the blocking. That would be your company. And in the standard, they made it clear that if a 603 response is received, so now that information is going back to the originator. If a 603 response is received without this additional syntax, the 603 plus information, then just treat it as a standard 603 message. So this is information that's going to go back to the originator for them to know, again, per the FCC requirements, that the call has been blocked at the terminating end. Now, what's important is the FCC has not yet made any ruling on 603 plus. It does seem likely they will make it optional in the future. They may make it mandatory, but it's probably not. Again, from my very earliest comment about the FCC is trying to look at pragmatic ways to approach this, I believe they'll make it optional. And right now, Ribbon's assessing the development efforts that we would need to support SIP 603 plus across our relevant products and when it would be available on our roadmaps for those products. So we do think 603 plus is valuable, but I want to point out that if you hear about this, it's not yet mandated, but it is part of this particular use case. And it's only if you're using an analytic solution to do terminating robocall mitigation. Again, that's something that should be valuable to your end customers, but again, it's not required. The FCC says if you use it though, we want you to do these additional things. I hope that all makes sense. So with that, let me just do a quick wrap up. I've covered a lot of information in the last 40 minutes. Start planning now. Assign target dates. Just decide when you want to do things and how quickly you can do them, right? Call us to discuss implementations. Reach out to your salespeople, right? Discuss the implementation options with us. If needed, start now. Allocate those budgets that you're going to need if you need to do some network upgrades, and look at when those can be executed on. Leverage Ribbon or Eastwind, our partner, for the implementation and testing of your solution. Whether or not that's the in-network version or you just are going to buy it as a service from us, right? And then ultimately, once it's implemented, you'll have to go ahead and update that FCC robocall mitigation database. And as I said earlier, you really need to look at the combined value of doing both originating robocall mitigation and stir shaking. We think it provides the best solution possible to prevent originating robocall calls from originating robocalls or illegal fraud from originating on your network. There is a link here on this page to our Stir Shaken page on our Ribbon website. It's hot linked, so when you get a copy of this presentation, you should be able to link to it. And that's really what I wanted to cover. And with that, I will put up one last item. I do want to remind everyone, if you've not already heard about it or registered for our Tech Forum event, We're holding that in Dallas in early November, the 2nd and 3rd. And while it's primarily focused on our IP optical portfolio, there will be sessions on next generation voice, on Stir Shaken, and on network security. So please go look at that agenda and register to attend. With that, I'm going to turn it back to either Lance, you, or Jamie for questions.
Okay, Dan, yeah, and I was starting to type some answers, but maybe we'll just take these verbally. The first one I was working on, and it's kind of a long answer, so talking through it would be better, is does Ribbon have a position on which TDM Stir Shaken solution is better, or have a kind of position on that is what I was, yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple things. So I talked about the enhanced Stir Shaken over TDM, and as a originator responsible for calls, it's critical you meet that obligation. That is one option. If you do not have IP, don't plan on putting IP in. I mean, clearly, I'll start with, if you can do IP and do Stir Shaken as a service, we'll start there. If you choose that you'll have IP, but you don't want to actually do the Stir Shaken, but you'd rather pay a next top provider to do that for you, you can do that. So either way, both of those are an as a service offer. Either you're buying the service from Ribbon and doing it yourself and your IP out to your next top carrier, or you're just going to hand that traffic off SIP with the attestation to a carrier. That's Stir Shaken as a service carrier, again, like a Bandwidth or a Telequint or others. If you have to do TDM, again, right now, we see a lot of advantages in using the TDM infrastructure you already have and not having to make any additional investment. And the obligation then becomes on the tandem provider to manage that information and put it out into the next hop beyond them. However, I did also indicate there is an out-of-band service as well. That is a valid solution that's been defined by Addis, but it has some drawbacks that should be acknowledged. So the first one is, if you only have TDM switching, well, it only works with IP. So if you only have TDM, you'll need to invest in a TDM to IP gateway for the interworking between TDM and SIP. And that gateway will interwork with the STI authentication and verification functions, as well as the STI out-of-band service that publishes this shaken passport, the information that's relevant to, it publishes it to and retrieves it from something called a call placement service. And it's that call placement service that people have to go look to and find the information for a call. Now, what happens in out-of-band is it has a high cost burden. And that high cost burden is not actually on you if you use out-of-band. Beyond, yes, you may have invested in a gateway, and you may have, but once that information is put up into the call placement service, the obligation now comes in to any carrier who's interworking TDM to SIP. So you started by putting that information out there, but now any other carrier in the path, they have to query the call placement service on every call, because they don't know which calls were added to the call placement service and which ones were not. And that cost burden that's placed on any carrier who's interworking TDM to SIP, even if they already do Stir Shaken, right, becomes something that the carriers are, and many of these carriers are going, why do I need to do that? Especially if I'm handling a large percentage of calls that are coming in TDM, when I don't need to do that. Like, I don't know whether this call needs it or not, but I have to do it. I have to go look anyway, right? And then the flip side is any carrier who's interworking SIP back to TDM has to place this STI data into the CPS on every call, unless they know with 100% certainty that call will not transition back to SIP. It may sound a bit confusing, but I'll keep it simple. It's going to require an investment in a gateway and this call placement service that has to be queried on every call. And that versus the TDM solution that I talked about earlier, where it's bilateral between you and the next top local tandem provider, and it's TDM, and you pass it on, and there's no additional investment there. What I will say is, and I do want this to be clear, right? There's no reason to invest in an out-of-band solution until the FCC mandates that carriers have to check the CPS, right? So even if you were to go with an out-of-band solution and register a call in the TPS, the carrier on the other end who's doing the interworking between TDM and SIP has to go check that CPS. If they're not checking the CPS because they're not mandated, then the information doesn't go forward. In other words, you've put information out into this process, but it's not going to be handled. It really comes down to what the FCC is going to mandate and how they're going to mandate it and what options they're going to leave for people. We're waiting to hear what they say on that. So that's kind of where we're at on those options.
Okay, yeah, I'm definitely glad I didn't try to type all of that into an answer. The next one's a little bit easier. You had mentioned something at the beginning of the call around the New York State requirements. So the question here is, what is the caveat for New York State? Something was mentioned at the top of the call. And I think it has to do with the time frame, the law that New York State passed, right?
Yeah, so I wish I could tell you more about why the New York State Public Utility Commissions did what they did, but they decided that the FCC obligation for carriers to do stir shake in June of 2023 wasn't early enough, and that carriers in New York had to do it by November 8th. So I would venture to say that that if you're not in New York State, it doesn't apply to you. And if you are in New York State, you've probably already figured out what you're going to do, because that's coming up in 3 weeks.
But it still only applies to the SIP side of the network, not to the TDM side.
Correct. It is implementing stir shake.
Okay. So I've got a question here from, it says, we're a utility and we're using a hosted provider for our voice. Do we still have to do stir shaken?
So I would have to get more information. Jamie, maybe you and I can talk through this, but if as the utility, you're not the telephone number serving provider and you're not the originating carrier either. I mean, is that what we should assume in that question, Jamie?
Well, if they're getting a hosted service, then I would anticipate that as part of that hosted offering, that service provider would be doing the stir shaking for you. I would say that if you're providing voice service to your customers and charging them for it, even if you subscribe to a third party for that service, you're probably accountable for doing it through that hosted service provider. So whoever owns, and I guess the technical answer is whoever owns the OCN that's originating the calls is responsible for signing calls that originate from that OCN. So
So I want to clarify something. They're certainly responsible for the attestation information. They may or may not be responsible, and they're responsible to have a certificate saying they are the originating carrier, but they may still be using that hosted service provider to do the stir shake and sign on their behalf, right?
Yep.
So the answer, I think, to the question is you need to talk to your hosted service provider and understand, are they planning on providing stir shaking on your behalf? You will still need a certificate, like Jamie said, as long as you're the originating carrier of record. If that's what you are, then you do have that obligation to do something regarding attestation and having a legitimate certificate for stir shaking. Was there anything else?
I don't see anything else in the chat or in the question list here.
Okay. Well, I hope this was useful. People learned something. Feel free to reach out to Ribbon and ask questions. I cannot emphasize enough. I said it earlier. I believe it bears repeating. We're here to help. We know what we're doing. We can make your life easier. And more importantly, you need to start the process now, so you don't find yourself on the 25th of June going, what am I going to do by the end of this week? It's just not a place you want to be. So I think we can help.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, and thank everybody for joining today. I did want to point out right before we sign off that handout is still available. If you want to click that customer checklist, be sure that you take that. The Ribbon Tech Forum, that's also in the chat and it's on your screen. Click that and check out the Ribbon Tech Forum this November. It's a really great event, and if you can attend, we'd love to have you. And then lastly, we'll have a replay in the slides for today's webinar. Later today, we'll get those out to you in an email, so be on the lookout for that. Again, we appreciate all your time today, and we will see you on the next webinar. The next Tech Talk Fall Series webinar is the 25th, I believe. So that's an IP optical focused session, but you'll probably be seeing an invite for that as well. So if you want to check that out, we'd love to have you for that as well. Dan, before we go, one more just did come in, so maybe we'll take a look at that. How many sessions will you have about Start Shaking at the forum? Do we know that answer? Or is that something we should look at on the agenda?
It's just one.
Just one session, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. So the agenda on that website there, the learn.ribbon.com/techforum22 has the agenda, and there you should see the outline of the days. If you want to make it for just one day or what have you, you can see what's available there. All right, thanks again, everyone. Appreciate the time today. We will talk to you soon.
Bye.